Mother insisted my husband was flirting with her. Turns out he wasn't. She lied to have him to herself out of some sick fantasy. All of us are cutting her off, and my father is getting a divorce. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs earlier. My mother has always been an overbearing presence in my life, the kind of person who had to be the center of attention in every room she walked into. She had a way of making everything about herself. Her opinions were the only ones that mattered. Her feelings always took priority, and she could twist any situation until she was the victim. But even with all of that, I never thought she would go this far. It started small. Little comments here and there about my husband, Daniel. She would mention how charming he was, how lucky I was to have a man like him, how he had the kind of presence that commanded attention. At first, I didn't think much of it. Compliments like that were normal, right? It wasn't strange for a mother to admire her son-in-law. But then, the comments became more frequent, and something about the way she said them started to feel off. She would talk about the way he looked at her, how he was such a gentleman whenever they interacted. She would bring up his smile, his voice, the way he carried himself. It was subtle at first, just enough to make me slightly uncomfortable, but not enough to raise any real alarms. I brushed it off as my mother being dramatic as usual. That was just who she was, over the top, attention-seeking. But then, out of nowhere, she dropped the first real accusation. She told me, straight-faced and serious, that Daniel had been flirting with her. I remember feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I asked her to explain, thinking maybe I had misunderstood, but she doubled down. She said that Daniel had been looking at her inappropriately, that he made suggestive comments, that he even touched her arm in a way that wasn't just friendly. I didn't know how to react. Daniel had never been anything but respectful around her, or anyone for that matter. He was polite but distant, never engaging in more conversation than necessary. He had told me before that he found my mother overwhelming and preferred to keep interactions with her brief, so hearing her say this didn't make sense. I told her she must have been mistaken, that Daniel would never do that, but she refused to back down. She started insisting that she knew what she saw, that I was in denial, that I was being blinded by love. The more I defended Daniel, the angrier she got. She told me that she was only trying to look out for me, that she was trying to warn me before things got worse. That's when she presented proof. She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages supposedly from Daniel. They were undeniably flirty, compliments, inside jokes, subtle suggestions that he wanted to see her alone. My stomach dropped. I felt sick. Daniel wasn't the type to text my mother casually, much less send messages like this. But the texts were right there, staring me in the face. I felt a mix of emotions: confusion, betrayal, anger. My mind was racing. Had I been wrong? Had Daniel really done this? I confronted him immediately. I didn't wait, didn't hesitate. I needed answers. When I showed him the texts, his face twisted in shock. He was confused, genuinely baffled. He swore he never sent them. He even pulled out his phone right then and there to show me. There was nothing. No record of those messages, no conversation thread with my mother that matched what she had shown me. That's when the uneasiness set in. If Daniel had sent those messages, they should have been on his phone too, but they weren't. And that's when it hit me. Those messages weren't real. My mother had fabricated them. She had used one of those apps that let you create fake conversations. I felt my stomach churn. Why? Why would she do this? I called my father, trying to make sense of it all. I told him everything, from the accusations to the texts, to my growing suspicion that my mother had set the whole thing up. His reaction stunned me. He wasn't surprised. That's when he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. Years ago, my father had a best friend, a man he had known since childhood. They were inseparable, always together, until one day, out of nowhere, his friend cut off all contact. My father never understood why. It was like he had just disappeared from his life. But now, hearing what my mother was doing, he realized the truth. She had done this before. She had accused his best friend of making advances toward her, twisting reality until my father had no choice but to distance himself. But back then, there had been no fake texts, no undeniable proof, just my mother's word against his friends. And my father had believed her. Realizing the depth of her manipulation, I knew I needed to act carefully. The next time she brought up Daniel's supposed advances, I pretended to believe her. I told her she was right, that I needed to confront him properly. I told her I wanted her to be there when I did. She was thrilled, too thrilled. That's when I knew for sure. I set up my phone to record before she arrived. I needed proof, not just for myself, but for my father too. When she started talking about the messages again, I pressed her for details. I asked her to tell me exactly what Daniel had said, how he had said it, what his reactions were. I watched as she got comfortable, confident, and then she slipped up. She said something that directly contradicted the fake messages she had shown me. I didn't hesitate. I laid it all out, telling her that I knew she had fabricated everything, that Daniel's phone had no record of those messages, that she had done this before. She froze. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her expression, shock, maybe even fear. But then, just as quickly, she snapped. She started screaming, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of turning on my own mother. She said I was choosing Daniel over my own blood. She ranted and raved, knocking over furniture, screaming at the top of her lungs. It was like a switch had flipped. My father, who had been listening in, finally stepped forward. He told her he was done, that he was filing for divorce. That's when she truly lost it. She trashed my living room in a blind rage. Daniel had to step in and physically remove her from our house. I called the police. She was arrested that night for disorderly conduct. Now, my father is moving forward with the divorce, and I am completely cutting her out of my life. My mother was willing to destroy my marriage for some sick reason. She doesn't deserve to be in my life. Update 1. After my mother's arrest, she spent the night in jail before my father bailed her out. Not because he felt sorry for her, but because he needed her gone so he could start the legal process. She had already destroyed enough, and he wasn't about to let her linger in their house any longer. I thought that was the end of it, at least for a while. I thought she would have to face the reality of her situation and, at the very least, keep her distance. But I had underestimated just how far she had fallen into her delusion. The very next morning, she showed up at my house again. This time she wasn't screaming or throwing accusations. She was crying, shaking, acting like a desperate woman whose entire world had been turned upside down. Daniel answered the door before I even realized she was there, and before he could react, she shoved her way inside. Her hands were trembling, her face streaked with tears, and she looked up at him like he was her salvation. She started rambling, speaking in a frantic, breathless rush, saying things that made my skin crawl. She acted as if some great secret had been exposed, as if everything was finally out in the open and nothing was standing in their way anymore. She kept repeating the same phrases, clinging to the idea that Daniel had been secretly harboring feelings for her all along, and now he was free to be with her. Daniel recoiled from her, horrified. He told her to leave, but she wasn't listening. She wasn't even looking at him like a real person anymore, just a fantasy she had convinced herself was real. And then she turned on me, her face twisted, all the sadness vanishing in an instant, replaced by pure fury. In her mind, I was the obstacle. I was the one who had poisoned him against her, the one who had manipulated him into denying his so-called true feelings. She screamed that I was the reason he was rejecting her, that I had always been selfish, that I had stolen everything that should have been hers. I was frozen in shock, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told her we had proof. I reminded her that we had recorded everything, that we had caught her in her own lies. I thought that would snap her out of it, that maybe she would feel some shame, some regret, but she didn't. She just shook her head, almost laughing, saying none of that mattered. She truly, wholeheartedly believed that she and Daniel were meant to be together, and that once I was out of the way, everything would fall into place. I called the police again. It was the only option left. There was no reasoning with someone who had completely abandoned reality. She was removed from my property, screaming the whole time, fighting against the officers as they dragged her away. This time, they didn't just let her go with a warning. A restraining order was issued, barring her from coming near me or my home again. My father, meanwhile, had wasted no time moving forward with the divorce. With her out of the house, he had already started separating their finances and gathering evidence to make sure she couldn't take anything she didn't deserve. But things took an even darker turn when he went through her belongings. While sorting through her laptop to remove his personal files, he found a hidden folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Some were notes, detailing all the little moments she had convinced herself were proof of Daniel's affection. Others were drafts of messages she had written, and never sent. Things meant to push him into confessing his feelings. But the worst of all were the photos. She had edited pictures to make it look like she and Daniel were together. Some were as simple as cropping me out of images and putting herself next to him instead. Others were more elaborate. Photoshopped images of them standing in intimate poses, some even in settings that never existed. It was sick. It was terrifying. She had been planning this for months, maybe even years. It wasn't just a moment of insanity. It was an obsession that had taken root long ago and had finally spiraled completely out of control. My father confronted her about it when she was finally released, asking her how she could do something so horrific to her own daughter. She didn't even try to deny it. She broke down, sobbing, confessing everything. She had become fixated on Daniel from the moment she met him. She had convinced herself that he was the man she was supposed to be with, that I had somehow stolen him from her, that she had been forced to watch from the sidelines while I lived the life that should have been hers. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had simply been trying to correct a mistake. Then my father asked her about his best friend. He asked if she had done the same thing back then, if she had ruined that friendship out of the same selfish fantasy. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look guilty. She just smiled and said that his friend had been in the way, just like he was. That was it. That was the moment my father realized there was no saving her. Whatever was broken inside of her, whatever sickness had taken over her mind, there was no coming back from it. He served her divorce papers that night. She didn't react, not in anger, not in sadness, nothing. It was like she had already moved on, like she had convinced herself that none of it mattered because she would still get what she wanted in the end. But she was wrong. My father had been preparing for this moment from the second he realized the truth. The evidence was stacked against her, and there was no way she could fight it. He was cutting her off completely, leaving her with nothing. Meanwhile, I was trying to process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer insanity of it all. It was almost too much to handle, but through it all, Daniel never wavered. He stayed by my side, proving over and over again that nothing my mother said or did could shake our marriage. We weren't just going to survive this, we were going to come out of it stronger than ever. And as for my mother, she was finally facing the consequences of everything she had done. For the first time in her life, she isn't going to get away with it. Edit. This is some details of what we found on her laptop for those who care. Among the usual files and documents, there was a hidden folder, one filled with notes, unsent messages, and manipulated photos of her and Daniel. The sheer detail in these files showed that this wasn't some fleeting obsession. She had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The messages she had written to Daniel but never sent were deeply unsettling. Some of them read like love letters, gushing over how much she adored him and how she wished he would wake up and see that they belonged together. Others were twisted fantasies of how she imagined their life together, how once I was out of the way, they could finally be happy. She even wrote about how she believed I would come to accept it in time, that I would understand and give them my blessing. Then there were the manipulated photos. She had taken normal pictures of our family gatherings and edited them to look like she and Daniel were standing closer than they were, their hands touching, their gazes locked. Some were worse. She had superimposed her face onto pictures of me and Daniel together, making it look like she was the one he was holding, the one he was kissing. It was sick. But yeah, the divorce is moving along so far from what my dad said. I'll update when I can. Update 2. The divorce process moved swiftly, much faster than my mother had anticipated. She fought against it with everything she had, filing objections, trying to claim that my father was being unfair, even attempting to argue that she was the victim in all of this. None of it mattered. The evidence was stacked against her, her own confessions, the fabricated messages, the manipulated photos. She had trapped herself in her own lies, and no one was willing to listen to her anymore. My father made sure to cut off every financial tie he had with her. For years, she had been dependent on him, using his income to sustain the life she wanted. Now, she had nothing. He sold the house they had shared, making it clear that she was not welcome back. With no job of her own, and no savings to fall back on, she was forced to find somewhere else to live. She tried reaching out to family members, but even they had turned against her. Her siblings, who had always been on her side in past arguments, wanted nothing to do with her. They were disgusted by what she had done. For years they had defended her, excused her behavior, but this was too much. She had destroyed her marriage, nearly ruined her daughter's life, And all because of a fantasy she had convinced herself was real. No one was willing to support her anymore. Desperate, she started reaching out to old friends, people she had once been close to but had drifted away from over the years. No one responded. Her reputation had been destroyed. Word had spread about what she had done, about how she had fabricated an entire affair, manipulated her own daughter, and tormented her husband. Even the people who might have once pitied her had no interest in being associated with someone who had gone to such lengths just to satisfy her own delusions. With nowhere to go, she ended up in a small, run-down apartment. It was a far cry from the home she had once shared with my father. She was completely alone. She tried dating again, seemingly attempting to prove to herself that she could still attract younger men, but it never lasted. No one wanted to deal with her. As for me and Daniel, we were trying to move forward. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I would wake up, replaying everything in my head, wondering how I had been so blind to what was happening. I had spent years ignoring the signs, dismissing the way she talked about Daniel, brushing off her behavior as nothing more than a mother being overprotective or overly affectionate. But looking back, it had been clear for a long time that something was deeply wrong. Daniel, as always, was patient with me. He never blamed me for what happened, never held it against me that I had doubted him, even for a moment. He understood how manipulative my mother had been, how deeply she had embedded herself into my thoughts. If anything, this entire ordeal had made our relationship stronger. I knew, without a doubt, that he would always stand by me, that no amount of lies or deception could ever come between us. My father and I grew closer as well. For years, we had both been living under her shadow, each of us dealing with her in our own way, never realizing the extent of the damage she had caused. Now that she was out of our lives, we had the chance to rebuild. He told me he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in decades, he was free. He even reached out to his old best friend, the one my mother had accused all those years ago. It had been an awkward conversation at first, but slowly, they started reconnecting. My father told me that losing that friendship had always been one of his biggest regrets, and now he had the chance to fix it. I had no regrets about cutting my mother off. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. There was nothing left for her to manipulate, no one left for her to deceive. She had built her world on lies, and now she was trapped in it, alone. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Final update. After everything came out, my mom lost everything. She went from being in control of our family to completely alone. She had built her life on lies and manipulation, but once the truth was exposed, she had nothing left. No one wanted anything to do with her. Not her husband, not her kids, not even the people she once called friends. My dad didn't waste any time finalizing the divorce. With all the proof against her and her own confession, she had no way to fight it. He cut her off financially, and she lost the comfortable life she was used to. The house was sold, and her reputation was ruined. Extended family, who had always looked the other way when she acted out, wanted nothing to do with her now. With nowhere else to go, she ended up in a small, rundown apartment. She still tries to act like she's desirable and in control, but no one takes her seriously anymore. She attempts to date younger men, hoping to keep up the illusion that she's still the person she used to be, but it doesn't work. People see through her now. The manipulation that worked for so long has lost its power. For me and my father, cutting her off completely was the only option. There was nothing left to salvage. The betrayal ran too deep, and keeping her in our lives would only bring more problems. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Since going no contact, life has been a lot more peaceful. Daniel and I are stronger than ever. Everything we went through just made us more united. There were moments when the stress almost got to us, but in the end, we knew we had each other's backs. This whole situation showed us how important it is to be with someone who truly supports you, and I'm grateful that we stuck together. My dad is doing better than I've seen him in years. He spent so much of his life trying to manage my mom's chaos, and now that she's out of the picture, he looks like a different person. He reconnected with an old best friend, the same one my mom drove away years ago with her lies. Fixing that friendship has been good for him. It's like he's finally getting back parts of his life that she took from him. Looking at everything that happened, it's clear how much damage my mom caused. She was willing to destroy her marriage, hurt her own kids, and manipulate everyone around her just to chase a fantasy that was never real. Now she's left with nothing. She has no family, no friends, and no one left to control. It's a fitting end for someone who spent her whole life trying to manipulate people. For the rest of us, life is finally moving forward. It's not about forgetting what happened, but about not letting it define us anymore. There are still moments when I think about everything we went through, but I remind myself that we made it out. We're free from her influence, and that's what matters. Her life and ours are in two completely different places now. While she sits alone, clinging to whatever scraps of attention she can find, we're building something real, something based on trust, honesty, and actual love. It's the exact opposite of what she tried to create, and that's why she lost. At the end of the day, the truth won. She spent years controlling people with lies, but now all of that is gone. She has no power left. Meanwhile, we're moving on, and for the first time in a long time, we actually have peace. That's the real ending to this whole mess. She lost everything, and we got our lives back. Edit. I want to thank everyone who has taken the time to read my story and share their thoughts. The comments I received have been both supportive and understanding. Many of you have shared that you too have experienced similar hurt and betrayal, and that means a lot. It feels good to know that I am not alone, even though the journey has been difficult. Over the past months, I have seen many responses that praise the decision to cut ties with my mom. Most of you agreed that protecting our well-being comes first, and that no one should have to suffer manipulation and false promises. It has been a long road, and while there are moments when the past still hurts, your messages of support remind me that I made the right choice. I have read every comment, and each one has helped me see that I am not responsible for someone else's delusions. Some comments focused on the pain of betrayal and the challenge of trusting those close to you. Many shared similar experiences of losing control over relationships due to toxic behavior. It is clear that we all value honesty and respect, and when these are lacking, the damage runs deep. I appreciate the way you all have pointed out that healing starts with setting clear boundaries and knowing when to walk away from harmful situations. A few of you asked if I ever regret cutting her off, or if I think there is any chance of reconciliation. I want to be clear, I have no regrets about my decision. The years of manipulation and false claims left too much pain in their wake. Reconnecting would only risk reopening old wounds. Instead, I choose to focus on what matters now, healing and building relationships based on trust and respect. This decision has allowed me, Daniel, and my dad to create a new chapter in our lives that is free from the toxicity of the past. Other comments mention the importance of community support. Many of you have reached out with advice and shared your own stories of overcoming similar challenges. I take comfort in knowing that our community values truth over comfort, and that we stand together when faced with hard choices. Your words remind me that while the scars of betrayal may remain, they do not have to define our future. Learning from painful experiences is what has helped us move forward, and I hope my story can be a small beacon of hope for anyone facing similar struggles. Several comments also touched on the need for self-care and the importance of trusting one's instincts. It is easy to doubt yourself when someone close causes such confusion and pain. I have learned not to ignore the gut feelings that warned me something was wrong. It was a hard lesson, but one that has made me stronger in the end. I encourage anyone who feels unsure or overwhelmed by similar situations to seek out support, whether it is from friends, family, or professionals. Taking care of your mental and emotional health should always be a priority. Finally, I want to express my gratitude to all of you who have reached out with kind words and encouragement. Your support has played an important part in helping me regain a sense of control over my life. I continue to work on healing each day, and I am committed to living a life built on honesty and genuine connections. While the pain of the past cannot be completely erased, your comments help me focus on the future, a future that is full of promise and free from the manipulation that once ruled my world. Thank you for standing with me and for helping me find peace in the midst of chaos. Your support has made all the difference.